Hello everyone, thank you for joining me in this special video I've made about my connection with the RMS Titanic. It's the story of a survivor, a butler and a country house. It was in the year 1912 and on this date, April the 12th, that the Titanic became one of the most infamous ocean liners in the history, with the tragic loss of almost 1,500 people. Allow me to take you to a small town in the East Riding of Yorkshire and to a modest country mansion which was called Tranby House. Like many country houses of the time, it was quite self-sufficient and relied upon a number of staff to keep it running, and the family who resided there in extreme comfort, although the staff lived in less so conditions, often in the attic. The modest house had 7 bedrooms, 4 dressing rooms, a drawing room, dining room, library and other rooms for the family to reside in, as well as extensive grounds, gardens and woodland. As you can see from the picture, it was an attractive home built in around 1800 and it belonged to the Barkworth family. Adjoining the house was a walled garden filled with fruit trees, and according to records it had a grape house, greenhouse, a forcing house, which is a heated area to encourage plants to grow out of season, like in the spring and winter, and cold frames. Along the perimeter of the outside wall there was an ornamental border. It stretched the whole length of the walled garden, and it was filled with all manner of herbaceous plants and climbers, and along the edge of the border there was a boxwood hedge, or box as we call it here. The walled garden was also divided into different areas with the same ornamental hedging, and it's unlikely the family would have visited the walled garden often, as it was really the domain of the servants, and it was a growing area for the food. You may wonder how I came to acquire these photographs. Well, some belong to me, others loaned, and some acquired through research projects, as this is a historically significant house which belonged to the first-class Titanic survivor, Algernon Barkworth, and it was my great-grandfather, John Henry Walton, who was his butler for at least 25 years, and prior to that, at least from the time of the sinking of the Titanic, he was a footman there. John Henry, when he was young, entered service at Tranby House, probably at the age of 14, which would coincide with the year 1912, and it's likely he would have been present when Algernon returned back from his perilous Titanic journey. John began life as a footman, and he always wore a white tie. He later went on to be conscripted into the army for World War I and was released from service in documents signed by Algernon until such a time he may come back. Fortunately for him, he did come back after being invalided out of the army due to an illness, as you can see in the photograph. He returned to Tranby House to be given the prestigious role of Algernon's butler, a role which he carried out dutifully until 1945 upon Algernon's death and the closure of the house. Going back now to the Titanic story, you may think because Algernon was a first-class passenger that he was afforded the luxury of getting into a lifeboat at the last minute. Many stories circulated locally that he got into a lifeboat dressed as a woman, but this is almost untrue. In actual fact, his account of the events that night are incredibly traumatic, to say the least. I'm quoting from a book I collaborated on, and I'll put a link in the description below, called Algae, The Privileged Life of Titanic Survivor Algernon Barkworth, written by the talented Bruno Paola, author and Titanic enthusiast from Brazil. It's an incredibly informative book, and it not only details the story of the Titanic and his survival, but his life story too, which is really interesting. There simply were no seats left in any lifeboats, and if there were, they were far, far away. In Algernon's own words, "I hesitated for a few moments before dropping, for the sea seemed full of chairs and other wreckage thrown overboard by the passengers, and I thought I should hurt myself. Fancy thinking such a thing at such a time." Nevertheless, Algae stepped off. He hit the water at tremendous speed from around 30 feet high, and upon doing so he badly injured his nose as he struck a piece of wood. And it was fortunate the said piece of wood afforded some buoyancy and a chance to recover from the freezing water, but not before a huge wave passed over his head caused by the collapsing of one of the funnels. He swam as fast as he could away from the vessel. Unfortunately, Algernon had the foresight to put on his fur coat as well as a life preserver before stepping into the water, which attributed to saving his life. As it seemed to trap the air in a tiny bit of warmth, he stated, "I shall never part with it." As he looked over his shoulder, he could see the Titanic sinking, and so he continued to swim further and further away and didn't want to be pulled under the water caused by the suction as it went down. It was as he was swimming in the dark that he happened to, quite by chance, to come across the upturned collapsible B lifeboat floating past. A dozen men were clinging to its sides. He was warned, as he clung onto it, "Watch out, you will swamp us." It was at this point Algernon stated he heard 3 distinct explosions and subsequently witnessed the eventual sinking of the Titanic. All that was left were the survivors in the water and their haunting screams. It was 2:20 a.m. Algernon and the others carefully boarded the boat until it could hold no more. There were around 30 men on the boat at that time, and during the night, sadly, 2 of them died. One slipped away into the ocean, and they managed to hold on to the other. Algernon said, "It is amazing how you lose your horror of the dead." I could hear the cries and screams of the people drowning. It was terrible to hear them. We could do nothing for them, for we were helpless on the drifting, overturned boat which was being swept away by the strong current. As the night went on, the men had to crouch on the boat's keel, and the icy water was washing over their feet and legs. To help prevent their limbs from freezing further, they decided to stand up one by one so not to overbalance the boat. You can see this depicted in the film A Night to Remember, which here is a photograph. Hours later, as daylight broke, the exhausted men on the upturned boat could see the Carpathia on the horizon, but they could not be rescued from this boat, it was too fragile, and so were able to call lifeboats 4 and 12 half a mile away with a whistle, onto which they later and very precariously embarked. One wrong foot and they would have gone into the ocean. Algernon found comfort in lifeboat 12 and was given a rug by a kind lady to share with his fellow boatmates, and he said, "The steamer rug was a great comfort as we drew it over our heads and huddled close together to obtain some warmth." Eventually the lifeboat met with the Carpathia. Men had to climb up a rope ladder if they could, and women and children were hoisted up in the side of the vessel in coal bags. Upon arriving on the Carpathia, Algernon was able to send 3 marconigrams back to Tranby House to alert his family to the fact he was indeed safe and had survived. The local newspapers reported this with much elation. One of the cablegrams, which recently sold at auction for a considerable amount of money, stated, "I'm safe on board Carpathia, Algie." Algernon and the other passengers were generously put up in hotels as they had no means to pay, and over the following days he gave several interviews and sent a cable to the local newspaper. Algernon remained in the United States until the 30th of April and said he did not wish to stay there any longer owing to his nervous condition, and sailed back home to England. He eventually returned to Tranby with his sister Evelyn and his mother Catherine, and no doubt the staff of the house were most pleased to welcome him home. In the house he had a glass case with his fur coat in and a shirt which was sea salt stained, and to keep them on display for visitors to see. He also had a large painting of the Titanic in the drawing room. And as time went on, Algernon recovered and went back to his old life, but no doubt the horrors were still haunting him, and he had to recover from those. It's heartwarming to know my great-grandfather John Henry would have heard Algernon's story firsthand, would have seen the fur coat and the sea salt stained shirt he wore that night, and be privy to all that he said. It is mildly frustrating that we don't have any of his recollections, but we do have 2 photographs of Algie and a portrait of his sister Evelyn. Here's Evelyn. Algernon went on to live a long life and died at the age of 80 in 1945. He was the last of the Barkworths at Tranby House, and so it was sold and converted into a school, which is fortunate as many houses like this were simply demolished. The following pictures show the demise of this country house and walled gardens. The areas were gradually stripped away, bulldozed and built over to make more classrooms, and today only a small section of the walled garden remains. Virtually all of the garden's landscaping have disappeared, a lot of the trees have too, all consigned to history. However, the importance of this house has been recognised, and in 2019 it was fully restored externally and internally, and a plaque to commemorate its importance was erected. I paid a visit to the cemetery where Algernon rests alongside his sister Evelyn last week to pay my respects, and so I'll conclude the story here. I hope you found it interesting, and I've really enjoyed sharing it with you. Please like and subscribe if you're able to, and share with your friends. It really helps my channel.